if we lived in a perfectly just world with harmonious relationships, then we would not need social mercy or any mercy whatsoever, because we would be living in an equilibrium where people respected each other. But it's because we live in an unjust world that we need mercy. We need to receive mercy, and we need to be merciful. And I'll be drawing upon my experiences as Bishop of Hull and Bishop of Liverpool, and giving some examples of where, in a socially unjust world, the Church responded with acts of mercy.
So the title is The Quality of Mercy in Social Justice. So I found the title really provocative. And I'm interested in who is required to ask for mercy, and who has the power to offer mercy. I'm interested in power in general, and how the way we've structured our society means that some people are constantly in a position of, as classes of people, of having to ask for our mercy or our compassion, whereas others receive justice.
Social justice is a term that's very easy to use, but I think rather more difficult to pin down. It's certainly distinct from the form of justice that is meted out by our courts, which has the law of the land as its yardstick. Social justice is often thought of in political terms, but perhaps that doesn't take us much further when all the political parties claim that social justice is at the heart of their agenda. We may be better off concentrating instead on the word social and the call to justice which that word demands, recognizing both our interconnectedness as people and the Judeo-Christian belief that we are all created in the image and likeness of God. But enough from me. We're fortunate tonight to have two speakers who could not be better qualified to speak about the quality of mercy in social justice. First, Bishop James Jones. Bishop James has been involved in social justice for most of his working life. He was formerly the Bishop of Liverpool, and before that, the Bishop of Hull. He's well known for having chaired many independent panels, perhaps most famously the Hillsborough Independent Panel on the Hillsborough Stadium disaster, in which 96 people lost their lives and many hundreds were injured, and which in 2012 concluded that no Liverpool fans were responsible in any way for the disaster. That resulted, amongst other things, in a memorable apology by David Cameron on behalf of the British government. Bishop James is still as busy as ever, but perhaps is best known to many of us for his illuminating and stimulating thoughts for the day on Radio 4. We're also delighted to have with us the Reverend Winnie Varghese, who's a member of the clergy team at the wonderful Trinity Episcopal Church on Wall Street, New York City. Reverend Winnie writes widely on themes of social justice, including her lively blogs on the global religion and spirituality website Patheos and on Huffington Post, as well as being the author of many pieces which are of direct relevance to tonight's theme. Let us welcome our speakers.
Thank you very much, Duncan, for such a warm welcome. And although it sounds a cliche, it is genuinely a privilege to be part of this scintillating series on the quality of mercy. I've written a few books in my time. I wrote one little book called Why Do People Suffer? And when the book arrived, or the proofs arrived back from the printers, they'd left off the question mark. So the title of the book ran, Why Do People Suffer, James Jones? This is probably what you'll all be thinking in about half an hour's time. Certainly what the Diocese of Liverpool thought after 15 years. I'm tempted to begin by saying that in a socially just world, there is no need for mercy. For if all the relationships are just and harmonious, and there's been no destabilizing of this equilibrium, then the giving and receiving of mercy is redundant. Mercy is the moral consequence of an unjust world. Shakespeare puts it into the mouth of Portia, a plea for mercy from Shylock. It's thought that the inspiration for this speech comes from Deuteronomy chapter 32, when Moses says, "May my teaching drop like the rain, my speech condense like the dew, like gentle rain on grass." If this is true, then the rest of the chapter in Deuteronomy explains exactly why, when it comes to injustice, we cannot ignore the need for mercy. Quote, "A faithful God without deceit, just and upright is he, yet his degenerate children have dealt falsely with him, a perverse and crooked generation." Shakespeare develops the theme of a crooked generation needing mercy from a just God. So Portia then says, "Though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy." It's the reality of our injustice that calls out for mercy from God, from one another, from society. One of the popular objections to belief in a good and loving God is the existence of injustice in the world. It's often expressed in the question, if there is a God, why doesn't he do something about the state of the world, the rampant selfishness, the ruthless oppression, the unjust structures? The question rightly calls for the God of justice to act against injustice. The gentle answer to turn away this understandable wrath is, if you want God to rid the earth of all the causes of human misery, who do you think would be left? Not I. We are all of us utterly dependent on the mercy of God, for not one of us is without some contribution to the injustices of this world. As Shakespeare later explains again through Portia, we do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. We, who are such debtors to mercy, are called to be the agents of mercy in a manifestly unfair world. The injustice of the world became manifest to me in my ministry as Bishop of Hull and then Bishop of Liverpool in 4 episodes, and I would like to share those with you this evening. First, Easter 1995. I was in my first year as Bishop of Hull. On Easter Sunday afternoon, I was asked to take a service on a tough estate where the church had been shut down after the priest had been sent to prison for child abuse. We stood in a circle in the church hall, some 25 adults and 25 children. The community worker, Marianne, asked if Stacey, an 8-year-old child who'd come with her grandmother, could say some prayers that she had written. Of course, I said. I began the service by saying sorry for the church's transgression, and later shared the sacrament with everybody, including all the children. But then I forgot to call Stacey forward to lead our prayers. Rebuked and reminded by Marianne, I then asked Stacey to pray just before the blessing. It was as if the risen Lord was saying to us all, to a child such as this belongs the kingdom of God. 6 weeks later, Stacey was murdered by a firebomb thrown through the letterbox of our house. I will spare you the details. Of all the children in Hull, Stacey was the one child that I knew apart from my own 3 children. I was asked to take her funeral. I shall not forget the scene that met me when I went to her grandmother's home to plan the funeral. What I can tell you is this, that at the age of 46, I found that much of what I had learned about ministry and mission turned to dust in my hands. What confronted me was the inequality between Stacey and my own 3 daughters. At her funeral, her head teacher called Stacey an angel on loan from heaven, and they played Michael Jackson's song, "Heal the World, Make It a Better Place." And from that moment on, I threw myself into the regeneration of the city. Later, I commissioned a sculpture based on the words of Jesus as he wept over the city of Jerusalem. If only you knew the things that make for peace. The making of peace involves naming injustice, and in the name of both justice and mercy, changing the structures of an unjust society. In both Hull and then Liverpool, as I became involved in urban regeneration by concentrating on education, the environment, and the economy, I noticed the different language that was used by people involved in these things. Those who lived in communities used organic language, seeds, planting, branching out, renewal. But those who controlled the money used not organic language, but mechanical language, levers, triggers, buttons, outputs. It struck me that you could not prescribe mechanical solutions to organic problems. You had to understand how and why a community dies before you can see how it might live again. Too often, those who used mechanical language lacked the merciful imagination to put themselves in the shoes of the disadvantaged. Whenever you encounter social injustice, I believe a Christian would not only support but initiate social interventions to correct the imbalance of opportunity and power. In Hull and Liverpool, the churches and the faith communities were active in programs of social mercy in both the state and independent sectors. Through the state, we took initiatives in education and the care of the elderly. In the voluntary sector, we engaged in credit unions, food banks, purposeful activities with alienated young people. Whereas social justice requires the reform of the structures, social mercy is often more immediately responsive as it's expressed by the initiatives of the independent, voluntary, and charitable sectors. When I arrived in Liverpool, I learned from the people of colour how excluded they felt, not just from society, but also from the church. This point had in fact resonated with me when I was a curate in Bristol. A pastor of a black-led church said how he came to this country from the Caribbean, and his mother had told him that when he arrived, he needed to do 3 things. First, she said, find a post office so you can write home and tell me you've arrived safely. Second, find a church so you can thank God. Third, she said, find a friend. He paused and added wistfully, I eventually found the post office. Both society and the church were hostile places to him. Liverpool, like Bristol, was a slave-trading city. The people of colour were not recent migrants to Liverpool, but had a history going back several centuries. When we marked the bicentennial of the abolition of the slave trade in 2004, their stories came to the fore. Researching for my sermon for the commemoration made me actually physically sick as I read of the brutality of how the slaves were treated in the ships and on the plantations. If only we could console ourselves by saying that this brutality was a thing of the past. This brings me to my second episode of injustice. The following year, in 2005, Anthony Walker, an immensely talented black teenager, was murdered in Liverpool with an axe to his head in a brutal racist attack. As with Stacey, I was asked to take his funeral in our cathedral. It was the largest mixed-race gathering I'd ever seen in the city. Just 6 months ago, I interviewed his mother, G, on BBC Radio 4's Good Friday meditation. Her testimony was compelling. I asked her what Anthony's murder did to her faith. She surprised me. It strengthened it. In her distress, she had only God left to turn to. Then, pointing to Christ on the cross, she spoke of forgiving Anthony's murderers. Here is mercy. And through such mercy, the victim becomes victor over hatred and death. I've learned so much through the community of colour. It shaped my understanding of injustice and of the Gospels. In fact, I now believe that the cleansing of the temple was not primarily a statement against commercialism, but a challenge by Jesus to racism. Let me explain. Those market stalls had been set up in the court of the Gentiles. The court of the Gentiles gave those not of the Jewish race a sacred space to show their faith in the God of Abraham and Moses, a sign, a sacrament in stone of a God without frontiers. However, by filling the court of the Gentiles, the court of the nations, with commercial stalls, the temple authorities were denying the non-Jewish peoples their sacred space to draw near to God. Jesus not only overturned the stalls, but then prohibited anybody else from carrying things through that part of the temple. Why? Jesus gave the answer by quoting the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all races. Jesus was railing against the injustice of depriving other races of their right to worship God in his temple. In cleansing the temple, Jesus was expressing the justice of God in favor of those who had been denied their rights. And it's a challenge for all those of us who belong to the Church of England that claims to be a church for England as to whether or not our membership and our mission measures up to this yardstick of being a house of prayer for all ethnicities. If it is in the denial of rights and justice that the opportunity for mercy is to be found, then we come to the third episode and my deepest experience of justice denied, which was the Hillsborough Tragedy, when 96 Liverpool fans were unlawfully killed. Shortly before becoming Bishop of Liverpool, shortly after becoming Bishop of Liverpool, I presided at the Anfield Stadium at the 10th anniversary of the disaster and could see that the tragedy was an open wound in the city. Through getting to know the families and survivors, I could also see that there was no prospect of healing until the families and survivors could learn the full truth of what had happened and hold those responsible accountable. I am constrained by what I can now say because the trials are ongoing 30 years later. However, immediately they are over, ITV will be broadcasting a drama in 4 one-hour episodes, which I urge you to watch. Nevertheless, this I can say. In 2010, the government asked me to chair the Hillsborough Independent Panel, which in turn led to those fresh inquests and a new determination of unlawful killing. Every day for 3 months, before the panel published its report to the families, I read these words from the New Testament. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had any respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, "Listen. Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" It's as if our Lord had told this parable for the Hillsborough families, and indeed for all those who in different ways have been and are denied justice. I used to think that that was a parable about prayer. I now believe it's also a parable about justice denied and the merciful attitude of God to those who feel tempted to give up hope of ever living in a just world. For 27 years, there was a memorial service at Anfield on April the 15th. At the last one in 2016, I was asked to give the address, and I spoke about my daily reading of this allegory of the widow pleading with the judge for justice. When I got to that part of the story of saying, "But she would not give up," the crowd of some 20,000 people began applauding and standing. On the way home on the train, I mused in my thoughts to God that 2,000 years after he first told that story, 20,000 people stood to cheer this parable of Jesus. It made me think that this thirst for justice is universal, and it's there at the heart of the gospel. And the calling of Christ's followers to help people trace back from their moral instinct for justice to the source of all goodness is indeed our calling. To trace back to that source of justice, the character of God as revealed in the just and merciful figure of Jesus himself. That's, my friends, why I love Jesus, if that doesn't sound too pietistic and sentimental. For millennia, the human family has cried out through poets and philosophers, through sages and songwriters, through artists and teachers, seeking the truth of our existence. The source of all truth heard our prayer and gave us not a set of propositions, but a true human being. The great irony of the Gospel of St. John is when Pontius Pilate is asking Jesus, "What is truth?" And the answer is standing in front of him, staring into his searching eyes. In his insistence on fairness and forgiveness in all human relationships, Jesus reveals justice and mercy as the pillars of the kingdom and of the character of God. This brings me finally to my fourth episode. In the millennium year of 2000, I went round the Diocese of Liverpool and met with thousands of young people to listen to their dreams and dreads of the future and to share with them why I thought the faith of Jesus was still relevant 2,000 years on. After showing a video clip of what might happen to the planet in the years to come, I asked them on a scale of 0 to 10, how worried were they about the future of the earth? Put up your hands, I said, if you've placed yourself between 5 and 10. 100% of all the hands went up in all 16 venues. To what extent should we do something about it, I went on. Those placing themselves between 5 and 10, 98%. Those young people challenged me to think again about my own values and to ask and to make me ask, what did Jesus say about the earth? I wonder how you would answer that. What did Jesus indeed say about the earth that is consuming our attention in this generation? Two things emerged for me. First, the one title that Jesus uses and takes to himself almost exclusively is the Son of Man, which means, in Hebrew, child of the earth. That's how he called himself, the child of the earth. Did Jesus have anything to say about the earth? And the second revelation to me was the central petition of the Lord's Prayer is for nothing less and nothing more than the earthing of heaven. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The earthing of heaven. And I have to tell you, there is a unique collection of sayings in the Gospels when Jesus calls himself the child of the earth, and in the same breath speaks about the earth. And here's just one. Just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights, so the child of the earth will be laid in the heart of the earth. And what happens when they do? The earth quakes. And when he's raised this child of the earth from the earth quakes again. This very earth that, according to Genesis, has fallen under a curse because of humanity's injustice, now, according to Paul's letter to the Romans, groans and cries out to be set free from the bondage of humanity's exploitation. And it has fallen to our generation to respond to this environmental crisis, which is overwhelming us. Crisis, of course, is the Greek word for judgment. And this is the judgment that we are reaping what we have been sowing. And in the face of this injustice, we need mercy, and we need to be merciful. In fact, the future of our social existence on this earth depends utterly upon the quality of mercy. We, all of us, are complicit with the crises of the world. For as the Apostle John tells us, if we say that we're without sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth isn't in us. So, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Or, as Shakespeare said, we do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. Kyrie eleison.
I actually had a choice about who went first, so I was wrong about that. So my name is Winnie. I'm a priest at Trinity Church, and I need some time with what just happened. That was amazing. And St. Paul's, where we are currently meeting because Trinity Church is being renovated, was recently renovated to look like this. It's exactly the same, so I'm a little distracted. And I think that must have been on purpose, because it looks almost exactly the same. Trinity Church, as you heard in our title, is on the end of Wall Street. And it's exactly what you might expect a church at the end of Wall Street would be. We are, Wall Street's a very short street. We're at the intersection of Wall Street and the Broadway, which the current rector says literally was the wall. It makes a point of saying the Wall Street was the wall, which tells you a lot about how walls work out wherever you build them. It is now a street with some pegs on the road to show you where the wall once stood. And it was a wall to protect a little tiny settlement at the bottom of Manhattan from all of the indigenous people above, all of the forests and all of the people, with cannons facing the other way to protect this tiny little settlement from people that might come by sea. It's about a mile, and that's where Wall Street is. And Broadway was the Broadway that went all the way up the island and is the actual old footpath and road used by people for generations and generations before colonists came to that island. And we sit right on the end of what would have been the sea right behind us. And what I've been told, and I don't know if this is true, that at the end of the Revolutionary War, we were on the wrong side at Trinity. The rector came in the front door and ran out the back and got in a boat and went to Canada to save his own life, which probably says something about all of us that work at Trinity Church on Wall Street. So the last couple of years, Trinity has been thinking through how to strategically apply the power and the resource of that place and its great history, 320 years worth, for the good of the city of New York and for the good of our communion of the world. In New York, we've ended up taking a lens of race and anti-racism and looking at the institutions that perpetuate racism in New York City and working to dismantle them or build up what would need to be built up to begin to undo these systems in our city. So the focus we've picked is homelessness and housing, so to be a part of eliminating homelessness in New York City, building housing and ending it. But the one I want to say a little bit about today, the other one is ending mass incarceration in New York City. Now these are both very doable tasks, but they'll take time and they'll take commitment and focus from us. And if we can do them, when we do them, we can change how racism has power in our city. We can change the landscape of our city. So Richard Serra, the American sculptor, any Richard Serra fans? He works in huge, got one. So you can ask him about these pieces. He's an American who makes enormous steel objects. It's a celebration of steel. I don't think there's any other way to describe his work. So of industry, of machines, of fabrication, sort of a celebration of America and the American spirit. These are tough objects, they're strong. And yet strange, and they're huge. They're the kind of thing that could be as high as this ceiling. They're enormous things. And yet, strangely enough, these are objects that you find yourself looking at and walking around and then walking through. And as you do, you find that your perspective shifts, and sometimes you find yourself enveloped in steel and emerging through these set boundaries of the piece into some kind of new horizon that opens out shockingly in front of you. Not all of them are like that, but many of them are. They're all big steel objects. A powerful tribute to a long-gone, robust industrial America. Serra was recently interviewed in the New York Times in his New York City studio and apartment, and he was asked if he sees tenderness in his work. I thought it was a great question because that is actually how I experience his work. And he replied, "I don't think in those terms. It sounds like you're talking about a steak." He meant beef, a steak. So when I heard the topic for this evening, I had a similar reaction, actually. Mercy assumes the justice of social justice is somehow not a justice at all, right? As we just heard. But compassion or something else tender or tenderized. Not deserved or right, which is what I think social justice assumes. That the ways of our systems, our institutions, the principalities and powers, as Paul says, are unjust and penalize those without the resources to wield power. These institutions are carriers of a collective sin imposed upon groups of people, and we all must collude, every one of us, in this sin for it to continue. Sometimes this collusion feels like powerlessness. I think that's the most common way. Most of us feel that, when actually we know that we have extraordinary power. This sin is racist and every other kind of ism that we have, and acts most violently upon people without enough resource to defend themselves from it. But I think I know what the interviewer meant that was interviewing Richard Serra. I've walked through some of Richard Serra's work in galleries in New York, and it can also be seen in fields in West Texas. He sometimes creates something like a room in a room, defined in what can feel strangely like delicate curves of rusted steel. The color of steel I remember watching rust through the school year from the back of the car on my way to school in Dallas, Texas, on sites that were in the 1980s emerging as suburbs, but recently had been independent little farm towns in northeast Texas with extant barns and farm fences and those weird gates that you make for cows, and sometimes you would actually see a horse or a cow as proof of who they very, very recently were. Steel and glass buildings began to mark a change that was coming and really had come to Dallas. one that left farmers and country people, Black, Mexican, and white, far behind. One that should have meant opportunity for them and for all of us, but meant that middle-class or middle-class aspirant migrants with college acceptance letters and student visas traveled the planet to the jobs in those steel and glass buildings. As you can hear, I struggled with where to place mercy in relation to social justice, where to bend the steel and where to direct your eyes. Social justice for me comes honestly in the traditions that I come from. I used to answer when I was asked why we should care about this as a church, I just said Jesus. That didn't go over very well. And so then I started to say the Gospels to help with a little more focus. People would still look at me quite confused in the places that I come from. So now I say, well, the reason is I'm from Kerala in South India. My parents and the people that I love are from Kerala. My father is from a place called Kaviyur, which can mean the place of poets or of makers, depending on how you interpret the Sanskrit. It is one of those original towns of 50 or so named in the epics. We are historic and poor and today utterly irrelevant, literally on a backwater called a backwater. The people there are simple farmers. It is a poor place, where in the month between harvests, when my father was a child, the poorest and the weakest might die of hunger. The month was named after the inevitable famine and suffering of that time. The local school, the only school taught in the local language, only had Marxists for teachers because the line was, who else would come there? There is still a Communist Party office right off of the campus marked by a really big flag. It's not an uncommon thing in Kerala. And I have a lovely picture of my 80-year-old father walking from that office to our taxi after asking directions to the 8th century rock-cut temple with larger-than-life-size carvings of the Pandavas in our backwater little place. We are country people. But country people who bore witness to the independence movement, land reform and land redistribution, caste reform, and resisting communalism. A community who was very articulate about who ended up in jail for an offense and who did not. Who was kept safe from whom, and to whom were we all truly vulnerable. Of course, the people we were truly vulnerable to were not the poor, but the powerful, whose quality it was, it is said, to have mercy. Mercy is a legal term. I haven't found a resource that does not imply a court of some kind, a deserved punishment for an offense and a generous restoration for an undeserving character. It's difficult for us as Christians because the language of our salvation is caught up in this term. We unworthy sinners, right? And the most arrogant and destructive among us can say those words of contrition from memory. What does it mean? Clearly, it has to do with power. God or a judge has power over a subject or one accused, and it seems convicted. Mercy is to not give to the one who has offended what they deserve. Of course, the most destructive among us should acknowledge this before their God. But what does it really matter if the ways of this world remain the same? And do we apply this equally for everyone? I'm interested in who it is we believe requires mercy. Brian Stevenson, in his excellent and important book, Just Mercy, demonstrated to us in the U.S. that those who must beg for mercy and those who get to grant it are not simply individuals who have erred and those who are victims, but classes of people. This is Freire and Gutierrez and Cohn, who argue that the landscape for systematic theology, where we define what mercy is and how it works for Christians, is a part of the apologists' project of the colonial project. And in the part of the world where I live, this is most visible in the genocide of the indigenous peoples of the Americas and in the enslavement of Africans. And this matters because guilt and innocence, rights and responsibilities are tied up in these conquests, and the category of mercy emerges in this space as well. It serves some well that a concept so legalistic and of this world is applied as a spiritual ideal. Guess, in the United States, who might be 12 years old and in prison for life? Guess. Guess who tends to be on death row. Guess who fills our prisons. Guess who is destined to beg for mercy, for compassion, for kindness, for tenderness in the systems we live within. When I think of the function of mercy in social justice, I remember Dylan Roof in Charleston, South Carolina, a young white man with a really strange haircut, a social media racist, walking into a Bible study in Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, sitting with a small group of middle-aged Black people in Bible study, hearing a text read and pondered aloud, as probably happens in this very room, and then standing up and shooting them, every one of them, over and over and over again, the ones who had welcomed him in Christian love. For whom is it to show mercy? Perpetually to show mercy for the brutality of the sin of this world. That congregation forgave him individually, in person, at his conviction, to his unrepentant face. Why him? The same is not done for them or for their children in their innocent day-to-day living in that city, in that country. Clearly they know something about mercy because they have lack of it. They demonstrated their claim to it as a power they have over their own souls. The police officers that arrested Dylann Roof, alive, often impossible to do, it seems, for people who are not white in our country, offered to take him out for some food. A stop at Burger King for a hamburger was offered. He must have looked like a child to them who needed to eat something. And maybe they didn't disagree with what he had done, but we don't actually know that. But they looked at him like their child. Of course, that has something to do with the lack of value of Black lives in our country, but it also has to do with what we want for all of us, a world that can see us, wonder if a little food might help or a gentle word, a world that holds us all accountable, of course, but also as beloved to one another. I probably far too flippantly in our conversations in New York about bail reform, and I'll probably do this again even though I've acknowledged that I'm very flip about this, will remind our congregation of the people accused of serious financial crime, of white-collar crime, who have made bail and sit at home in luxury awaiting a trial, and sometimes sit in our own congregations, and who it is that sits in jail for accusations of follies like offending a police officer or resisting arrest, petty theft of essential Les Mis type objects of nothing, and just accused, not convicted, but waiting in the brutality of jail for lack of money, lack of cash, an amount of money for bail that is negligible for most of us. Who do we, the systems of this world, make to require mercy? We are told to be convicted of the injustices to which we collude. Isn't it interesting how much of our theological language is judicial? We are to be convicted of the injustices to which we are called to bear witness. The couple sleeping outside, the neighborhoods we strip of services, migrants, the descendants of the enslaved and indentured, the sick, the lost, those trapped in systems that force them to ask of us mercy. Mercy applies to them in their disenfranchisement. They are in desperate need of it. But that can't be the only way, and it is not just. The judicious mercy of a powerful state imposing an order upon those who lose in their game of reordering. Now, justice is something else. My dad got lucky in that little town. His father had land, and trees grew on that land that had literally valuable leaves upon them. So even if the harvest of rice or tapioca had not come in, or while they were waiting for it, they could gather leaves to sell, literally, to pay for food or school fees and whatever else required cash. The leaves fell, in mercy, it seems. They had no idea, but they were searching the ground for their own salvation. What would have become of them without food and without school? I wonder if the ones the world tells us require mercy are the ones that we should look to for our own redemption as a people and as a society. Are they not the betrayed? And for our personal sin, in the end, all we can be accountable for, I don't believe mercy is what we need as much as compassion for our broken, failed, rinse-repeat, marketed to selves. The Bible tells us God delights in this good creation in all of us, in the earth. It is sin that makes scapegoats and victims. And I wonder if the concept of mercy, particularly in social justice, is only necessary because of that sin. So shouldn't we address the sin itself? What if we were responsible for our harm, especially those of us who have some control over our lives, responsible to redeem and reconcile the systems of which we are a part? Is that merciful, or is that simply just? In the U.S., there's a wonderful new generation of Black writers inviting us to tenderness in the way that we engage one another, by writing their own personal stories, raw and vulnerable and true, in the great tradition of people like James Baldwin, Austin Channing Brown, and Ross Gay, and others in this generation, and in a different way, Brian Stevenson. There's something powerful about the invitation into the private space of a life that stands in powerful relief, of a Black life that stands in powerful relief to the brutality towards Black bodies and souls in the U.S. Ross Gay, who's a beautiful writer and professor of writing in Indiana, tells a story of growing a garden in Indiana, because he has a yard, and bending over to harvest a beautiful thing that he has grown for a beautiful dinner that he is planning with his family. He describes this very simplicity of the movement of leaning down and the effort of making something beautiful and healing. He then describes in a way that would have all of us clutching our backs, his back seizing up as he bends over. All of us of a certain age know exactly what that is. And from that physical pain takes us back one day in his life to a traffic stop. The young white officer, and then Gay's insistence on staying calm and centered in the interaction. It is as though he walks us through his own meditation, that he is going to be himself, being true to his own humanity and the humanity of the young man who had stopped him. It starts out okay, and then it goes too far. It is humiliating. He is policed. He lives. But he has been reminded that he is being watched and he does not have power. His body retains it, and so he must ease his body back to health and recovery. Austin similarly enacts mercy by writing about her experience of interpreting Blackness for white evangelicals, the community of her church. Interestingly, her audience is overwhelmingly Black people, which I find fascinating because the book is called Dear White People. The grace is offered to white people, an invitation in, but I guess the grace is also the solidarity of seeing your own experience on the page. I've raised these two, and there are many others, because this is what mercy looks like, isn't it? And I hope you can hear that I find it very frustrating as well. The project of telling these true stories is cool, of course. I hope they make a lot of money, frankly. But how horrifying that we are writing about our own humanity, falling on the mercy of literary America, so that we might be, what? Profiled less, shot less, ignored less, followed less. What more is mercy? I wonder if those who are part of the groups of people collectively forced to call upon mercy might be for us the only teachers of where we have collectively gone wrong. It's interesting that it's not France falling on the mercy of Haiti, is it? Or the United States government appealing for mercy from native peoples, or the descendants of the enslaved, or England to India, or Belgium to the Congo. Those are some things to make right. There's a lot of place for mercy there. To me, that is where mercy should be applied, but of course it is not. Mercy applies where justice is inadequate, or where justice has failed, where the full force of the evil one is visible. An evil we might work to restore over the generations, and I think we must, like bending enormous sheets of steel, impossible without a collective effort, quite brutal in its construction, and yet framing a new horizon, an unexpected dip and curve that draw the hand and the eye in a new way, in the end, more humane, and yes, tender.